Hey, how's it going, everybody? We thought we would record a very short intro for this podcast. I guess that's what we're calling it, right, Todd? How do you want to call? What do you want to call this?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was a podcast when we put this together. But what you're going to hear today is the first thing that Mark and I did together back in 2014, released in February of 2014, when Thomas tried to be a grave robber. And as you're saying, Mark, we released as a podcast. Still kind of think of it that way, but now it's got a new life on YouTube as whatever you want to call these things, podcasts, radio dramas.
I don't know. And just so everybody knows, we do have this thing bundled together as an audiobook for sale in Amazon and Audible. But obviously, since now we're putting it up on YouTube, there's no real reason to buy it. But yeah, I kind of think of it like a radio drama. When we were writing this, that's kind of what I was envisioning. Those old school, The Shadow, Green Hornet, Lone Ranger, those types of things. That's how I envisioned it whenever we were writing it.
Absolutely. I was just reaching for my record collection, and this was
Nice.
some of the stuff that my dad would listen to AM radio at night because he had trouble sleeping.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
these scary ass stories would be on and just keep me up more. But I remember asking him in the morning, like when it was daylight, what's the shadow look like, and he would say, well, it's radio. They're just talking into microphones. And I got my first taste of kind of radio drama. And so, yeah, I think Mark and I both have a love for that old stuff. And so we wanted to tell some new stories, but also kind of with this stuff in the back of our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And Todd, you had the first half of this, or maybe the first, maybe third of it written by the time I kind of jumped in. You already had the idea for a professor who was down on his luck to start robbing graves to try to get some money. And you had that first third written, and that's the first thing that we have shared on Google Docs. And that's when I kind of jumped in on it.
That's right.
I hesitate to give too much of the plot away before we actually let people listen to it.
Yeah, I guess we'll just say, besides it being the first thing we did together, it was the first time I worked collaboratively on Google Docs. I mean, here we all now with the coronavirus are forced to work that way, and it's kind of the new normal. But I didn't know, like, you live in Austin, I live in San Antonio. I didn't know how to write when you're not physically in the room together, getting that energy going from being in person. But I kind of knew for me that you and I wrote well together and worked well together.
Yeah.
Just from that, even though we were working remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. And this really was, I think, and we talked about this before, this really was the training ground for us working together in the future. And it was amazing to me, and I know it was for you too, how quickly we kind of meshed as collaborators. It was really easy to bounce ideas off of you. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about this afterwards. I don't want to give away any plots, but you help rein in some of my bad tendencies and control me a little bit more than I'm used to being controlled, which is a good thing. So it was really great for me to be able to bounce ideas off of somebody else and to keep me focused and on track.
And, sometimes when we joke and post things kind of in character where we're getting pissed off at each other, I think one of the things about me that I like to make a caricature of that you help rein in reality and in character, is that I love having big ideas.
Right.
I don't always follow through, and I don't think about act 3 very, very much. It's like act 1 is big, act 2 is fun, act 3 may never happen. I may never finish this thing. And you always had that patience to see the threads from earlier on come nicely to a close. So I think, yeah, naturally we just kind of figured it out.
Yeah, and it works so well. And I think the other thing we should mention before we let folks listen to it is kind of as an afterthought, you sent this to your cousin, Ricky, at Texas State to just see if who's a music professor at Texas State, to just see if it's something he might be interested in collaborating on. And we got back this amazing original score that he threw together for this. And he wrote it for this story. And he's been writing with us. And I say writing, he is writing with us. he's been writing with us since. And it was an amazing experience for me to hear what I wrote inspire someone else in a different artistic way. And
Yeah,
so when we got
absolutely.
that back, I got chills. I don't know about you, but when I listened to it for the first time, absolute chills just because of how emotive it made our writing.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I know Ricky is a fan of Like-Minded Lunatics, so he'll be watching this. Ricky, we want to work with you forever, and we're so grateful for what you did, because you did really, you turned our like lump of coal into a diamond. We had a pretty okay thing together. It was
Yeah.
interesting and funny and dramatic and all of that. And you added this next thing, and Mark and I just thought we were gonna piece this thing together with free audio online and find sound effects, and then we got this polished thing back. So absolutely, and we hope to bring Ricky in on one of these videos here in the near future. So I'm the guy who always talks too much. So Mark, why don't you tell us the last few things we should know before folks check out this audiobook?
I actually don't want to prompt them too much for the story at all. The title, I think, is prompting enough. Make sure you stick around after the actual narrative. After the music ends, we'll have a brief outro where we talk about the characters and that type of stuff. But please enjoy When Thomas Tried to Be a Grave Robber.
When Thomas tried to be a grave robber. Right now, Thomas is leaning inside a crypt in Cloverleaf Mortuary's small cemetery, trying to figure out how in the fucking fuck he got himself in this mess. Less than 100 yards away is a private investigator with a gun pointed at the door of the crypt, waiting for Thomas to make a break for it. Of course, Thomas doesn't know it's a private investigator. The only thing he actually knows is that there's a crazy fucker pointing a gun at the only exit. God damn it. The drizzle is turning to rain on this cold December evening, and Thomas is paralyzed in his hiding place, looking toward the tomb he'd been trying to bust into a few moments ago. Just a few months ago, Thomas had never stolen anything in his life, and now almost every night he was digging up rich people's bodies, stealing their treasures, and selling them. He can imagine what his sweet dead mother would have said to him about all of this. He imagines the conversation they would have had as he catches his breath. "What did you want me to do?" he would have argued. "They made me part-time at the university. I was making almost nothing. I don't like digging up graves, but Sarah and the kids need this." "But honey," he could see her pleading, "the dead are people too. We're people." Thomas popped his eyes open to avoid the image he'd created of his mother, an amalgam of the woman he'd known and the skeleton of a bird. When she'd pleaded and used the word people, people like that, she'd looked like a sick pelican mocking a chickadee. Jesus. He'd been imagining all kinds of weird shit lately, but this was the worst. And yet if Thomas was honest with himself, he didn't really regret getting into all this grave robbing. He saw it like practicing a craft, some old forgotten trade like moonshining or shoe repair. He was a grave robber, and he was turning into a decent one. He was uncovering buried treasure and saving his wonderful family in the process. But this fucking creep who'd been following him was making things difficult. As he waited out the rain and the maniac, he thought back to how all this got started. He thought back and remembered that the same day his boss had told him they would have to take him down to a part-time instructor because of poor attendance at the school was the same day he got the idea to make money grave robbing. It was serendipitous. He'd walked into his barber shop like he did every third Thursday on the way home from work, and he'd sat down in Gary's chair like he always did. He was upset about his job and not looking forward to telling Sarah when he got home. Gary started snipping away at Thomas's hair when a police officer strolled in. He sat in the chair next to Thomas and let out a big, fat cop sigh. "Hey there, Jimmy," his old barber said as he approached and tossed the apron around the cop's shoulders. "How you doing?" "Ah, fucking bullshit," the officer blurted. He was a toad of a man and rested his meaty hands on his stomach. "Uh-oh," the barber said, and got started on his hair. "What's the trouble?" "Well, I was working for this mortuary on my off time, Cloverleaf on Old Austin Highway. They were paying me to do security at night over there at their little cemetery. Around Halloween, you always get teenagers sneaking into cemeteries and causing trouble." "You don't say." "Well, nothing too bad, just fucking kids making out and drinking beers and leaving their empties behind. It was easy work. Once every couple of nights I'd have to shoo off a couple of douchebags, and they were giving me $20 an hour for it." "Mm-hmm," his barber had said. The man was deep into his work now, and hardly listening to the cop, but Thomas had been listening closely. Anything to take him away from his troubles. "Anyway," the officer continued, "now that Halloween is over, they say they don't need security anymore. They told me last night. I'm out $2,000 a month right before Christmas. Fucking assholes." "Well, it's their loss," his barber had kindly added. "Goddamn right it's their loss," the cop boomed. "You know how many millionaires, maybe even billionaires, they got buried in that place? If someone had the brass to dig up those bodies, they'd make themselves a shitload of money." "Dig up? People still do that?" Thomas chimed in. "I didn't know there were still grave robbers." "Well, shit, yes. I never heard of it happening around here, but sure it happens. And let me tell you, Cloverleaf only has security cameras inside the mortuary. Without me, they have no eyes on that cemetery. People must be out of their minds." It was instantaneous. The moment the word grave robber came out of his mouth was the moment Thomas knew he had found a way to keep their house, to give the kids a good Christmas, to be able to hold his head up high as a provider. Thomas never told Sarah about his job. He'd wanted to be honest with her like he'd been when they were young, but at dinner, as she brushed her hair out of her face while serving mashed potatoes to the kids, he could tell her world-weary face couldn't handle the bad news. He would handle this on his own. Thomas waited for 2 nights before actually robbing the dead. He sat in his car, nervously chain-smoking cigarettes, for more than 2 hours under a pale, cold moon, working up the courage to jump the fence into the cemetery. He brought his late father's tool belt, a shovel, a pickaxe, and a garden hoe. He was also wearing a yellow headlamp, and the trunk of his car was filled with gardening tools. Thomas didn't know what it would take to dig up a grave and bust open a casket, so he figured he'd better bring enough tools to tackle any problem. Wandering into a Home Depot covered in grave mud wasn't really an option. As Thomas struggled to throw both the shovel and the pickaxe over the fence, he cursed and muttered, "Shouldn't have brought so much shit." Thomas roamed around the moonlit cemetery looking for an appropriate grave to rob, as if he was shopping for a new set of drapes. He'd somehow managed to push the morbidity of the task out of his mind, and even though he hadn't done the deed as of yet, he already thought of himself as a grave robber. "Grave robber," he said to himself as he walked. Thomas liked the sound of it. He finally happened upon a fairly ornate gravestone with the name Clarissa Troshold chiseled on the granite surface. "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother," it said below a picture of a cherub. Thomas recognized the name. The Trosholds were an old, wealthy family. Clarissa had died at least a decade ago, which was good because Thomas had already decided he wasn't quite ready to break into a fresh grave. This'll do. Thomas dropped his pickaxe and held the shovel hesitatingly above the soft ground. Moment of truth. The shovel shook. Thomas thought of his kids, of Sarah, of his boss's fucking face when she slashed his semester schedule in 2. The shovel sliced into the ground, and Thomas used his foot to push it down even farther. As he dug, Thomas started whistling a tune. He thought a good grave robber would whistle as he worked. An hour later, and roughly 4 feet down, and Thomas had stopped whistling. When he'd imagined how the night would go, the digging had gone much faster. And in his imagination, his goddamn back hadn't hurt so much. Gotta remember to swipe some of Sarah's leftover Vicodin next time, he grumbled to himself. By the time Thomas reached the top of the casket, he wasn't entirely sure that he had enough strength left to bust it open. He brushed the loose soil to the side to get a better look. Cold, silver metal. Thomas adjusted his headlamp to get a better view. "How in the fuck am I going to break into this thing?" he said as he stood up and put his hands on his hips. Thomas crawled out of the grave, found his pickaxe, and then crawled back in. He didn't have a lot of room to get a good wind-up, but he brought the pickaxe down as hard as his exhausted body would allow. The point hit and slid across the slick metal surface, barely making a scratch. Thomas tried again. This time the scratch was a little deeper, but that was about it. Thomas had just about had enough. "Ah, fuck this," he said, as he threw the pickaxe down. He plopped down on his butt in exhaustion, and as soon as the full force of his weight landed on the casket, he heard and felt the top move. Thomas scraped and dug the dirt from around the top of the casket, and he found that the seal holding it shut had simply disintegrated from erosion and water damage. He laughed as he pulled the top up, but the sight of the corpse shut him up pretty damn quick. Clarissa Troshhold had been buried in a lacy blue dress, but time and water had not been kind to the delicate cloth. The lacy blue fabric had rotted into strips of brown and black rags, and they hung over her desiccated corpse like a moss in a cypress tree. Thomas was momentarily taken aback at the ghoulishness of what he was doing. He stared at her skull. Skin still clung to it in places, and the remaining portions of her lips had turned the remains of her face into the smiling visage of death. The full weight and seriousness of his new enterprise fell on him, and for one brief moment he wasn't sure he could continue. Then he remembered his boss's condescending tone when she'd said, "We're sorry about this, Thomas." And he said, "Fuck it." At first, Thomas was a bit squeamish rummaging around in the casket. He tried to avoid touching the body initially, but after he accidentally snapped one of Clarissa's fingers off, which incidentally sounded like a dry twig on an old tree, trying to get one of her rings off, all his tentativeness quickly flew away. It didn't take Thomas long to pull all the valuables off the corpse. Afterwards, he sat in his car staring at the treasures he'd found. 4 gold rings, 2 diamond earrings, a diamond-encrusted brooch, and a necklace with a delicate leaf pendant that had been made out of gold. Thomas had accidentally torn Clarissa's skull off her body trying to get the necklace. It was so goddamn dark, and he couldn't find the clasp, but he felt like it was worth it. In the following weeks, Thomas hit several other cemeteries around town. He was getting worried that Sarah might be a bit suspicious about his late-night excursions, but his paper-thin explanation that he'd started picking up shifts in the university's writing center seemed to be working. Either that, or Sarah knew he was full of shit and just didn't want to ask where he was going and where he was getting all this extra dough. Most of the treasures Thomas had taken he'd quickly put up on Craigslist and moved, but he kept one thing to give to Sarah: a jade necklace. He wasn't sure which grave it had come from. Thomas wasn't even sure if he'd stolen it from a casket or a crypt. He started hitting both lately, and he definitely preferred the crypts. Prying off lids was easier than digging 6 feet into the ground. As soon as he'd examined it, he knew it was perfect for Sarah. Her face lit up when he gave it to her. It was beautiful, if a bit macabre. In the center sat a crouching winged hound, or sphinx with a semi-canine face, and it was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion with a small piece of green jade. On the back, someone had inscribed A, along with some weird little letters and a small, malevolent skull. Sarah loved it. She still had a soft spot for 90s gothic chic, and that necklace had gotten him several nights of dirty sex. All in all, Thomas felt pretty good about his new enterprise. That is, until this fucking guy started shooting at him. Thomas didn't know how long this guy had been following him. He'd only noticed the weird little man 2 days ago on campus. After he'd finished a class, Thomas had been answering questions from students when he noticed a short, bearded guy looking in the classroom. Thomas thought it was another professor waiting for him to get out of the room, So he waved at him and smiled to let him know he was trying to hurry. When Thomas waved, the stubby little man looked surprised and quickly hurried off. Thomas didn't think anything of it. College professors were notoriously weird people to begin with. But then he saw him at a service station where Thomas was filling up his car, and he was pretty sure he saw him at a Wendy's when Thomas was selling some old coins to a dude from Craigslist. Just to be sure, after the sale, Thomas bought a Frosty and slunk down low into a booth. Sure enough, he saw the guy in an old Ford LTD drive slowly through the parking lot, looking around curiously. He even slowed down to a crawl when he got near Thomas's car. Thomas had convinced himself that the guy was a police officer, or a PI. Thomas wasn't wrong. And then, tonight had started out so goddamn good. He'd had dinner with Sarah, sold some jewelry to a guy in the Walmart parking lot, and then went to work. Thomas had identified 3 jobs for tonight: 2 graves and a tomb in the Cloverleaf Mortuary's crypt. He'd finished the 2 caskets quickly enough. They'd both been old graves, so no vaults. One of the caskets had even been wooden, and Thomas made short work of it with a little hand axe. But as he was walking towards the crypt, he thought he saw some movement several hundred feet to his right. He turned and looked, but all he saw were the tops of gravestones embowered by big, droopy trees. Little bits of drizzle sparkled when they fell through the guard lights. He kept walking, thinking he'd just spooked himself. When Thomas got to the crypt, he pulled out a large metal punch and a ball-peen hammer. He placed the tip of the punch in the lock and started whacking away. But Thomas wasn't worried about it. It was after midnight in a rural cemetery. It was cold and rainy, and weather.com was predicting sleet. No way in hell anyone was around to hear his hammer strikes. After several hits, the old lock surrendered and the punch pushed through. Thomas wiggled it around in the cylinder to knock out all the tumblers, and just as he was pulling the bolt back with a screwdriver, he heard someone behind him yell, "No!" Thomas spun around and saw that same weird little bastard who'd been following him standing behind a tombstone. His face was knotted up in rage. But most concerning was the revolver he had pointed directly at Thomas's head. Thomas didn't bother to answer. He swung the door to the crypt open, jumped inside, and slammed it behind him. As it banged closed, he heard the man unleash a guttural, "No! No!" Thomas stood with his back on the door. He gulped in air. He dropped his tools when he jumped into the crypt. "What the fuck?" he whispered. Thomas waited motionlessly for several minutes, the only sound his dry, ragged breath. Finally, he decided to risk a peek. He slowly moved the door just enough so he could fit his head out. He looked around as much as the small opening would allow when out of nowhere he heard the crack of a gun, followed immediately by the sound of a ricocheting bullet. Thomas pulled his head back so fast that he hit his left cheek on the door. He fell onto his butt and sat in disbelief, blood now dripping down his shirt. "What the fuck is going on?" Thomas asked himself.
All right, you guys, I hope you enjoyed that. When Thomas tried to be a grave robber, we got to hurry because Todd's running out of battery. Todd, what did you want to say to wrap this up?
I love the cliffhanger there at the end. I think a fun behind the scenes thing for people to know is that how much does a writer know about the rest of their narrative, you know? And I'm going to say sometimes you have writers who plan way ahead, and sometimes you have writers who try to figure it out as they go. and there are benefits and drawbacks to both. And I think we're about 50-50. I mean,
Yeah.
we knew it wanted to continue. We had an idea about some of the stuff that would happen in the next act. But if you hit the cliffhanger at the end and wonder, boy, am I really being led by masters here? No, we didn't really know what was going to happen.
That's such a great point. I hate to swear too much, but I had no fucking clue what we were going to do at the end of that. And in fact, we have a whole email list of things that could have been, and none of them happened. The only thing that happened was the bare bones for the next section when Ronald tries to be a private investigator. The bare bones of that happened. Nothing else. I have literally a whole document about world building. None of it happened. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We wrote up to this point. We're like, man, let's see what happens from here. And it was way different than what we planned. Also, and this is something that I want folks to pay attention to, the naming scheme of each one of the episodes. The subject tried to do something. This was something that Todd was adamant about from the very beginning, that all the characters that we write about in this series should either be incompetent or lazy and slothful or something. And so the titles should reveal something about their failure. And that, I don't want to say too much more beyond that. But
I agree. I think we both love superhero stories, and we both love heroic stories. And I think when you and I gel about what our Venn diagram overlap is in our favorite kinds of stories, it's stories not about heroes. It's stories about people who have limited capability and limited mental capacity to accomplish something, and what happens when they try to do something and they try about 50%, which is, if we're honest, what a lot of us are doing, right?
Well, and the other thing too about that is they try and they only work about 50%, but they're trying to do something that's already out of their grasp. But then they're only half-assing that. And so they're only about a quarter of the way there by the time they get to the end of the thing. And that happens, I think, with all three acts of this thing.
So because my source video is going to die soon.
Gotcha.
Please, Mark, tell them what to expect. That we do have 2 more parts coming to them soon, and that there is a mythical 4th part that won't be seen or heard for a little while.
Right. So next week, we're going to release When Ronald Tried to Be a Private Investigator. We'll do an intro and outro for that one as well. And the following week, we will present the last part of the trilogy, which is When Wade Tried to Save the World. Intro and outro for that as well. We also performed what we consider to be a prequel to this called When Clarissa Tried to Steal the Amulet. I do think it needs to be heard after you hear the original trilogy, though. I think it's more impactful that way. But that's kind of the plan for here on out. Next week, When Ronald Tried to Be a PI, and the next week after that, When Wade Tried to Save the World. Intros and outros for each one, and you'll get the entire experience.
Right on, man. Well, I think we should wrap it there because I feel like we might still have an audience watching.
Cool. All right, man. Thank you.
All right, brother. Bye. And you guys, subscribe, like, do it all, because we don't know if you're listening or watching unless you do.
Yeah, that's right. And the subscribing is very easy on your part, just a click, but it means a hell of a lot to us and a hell of a lot to YouTube's analytics. So,
and I heard a rumor that something bad happens in your body if you watch something and enjoy it and then don't give back that subscribe. I hear there's something that starts to grow. I don't want to get people who are superstitious upset.
Sure.
But it's something to really think about.
It's something that they should mind for their health. Okay, we'll leave them with that. Subscribe or get sick. I think is what Todd's trying to tell you, is subscribe or you're going to get an illness. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.